Hello and welcome back to Stage 2. Our next speaker has done more than any journalist to give an activist voice to the environment, from his platform at The Guardian and from his books, which include Feral, which is about rewilding, and Out of the Wreckage, on how to frame a new politics. I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, George Monbiot, and he's going to be speaking about, he's going to come up with even more ways to save the planet and be specifically talking about food systems. Hello, George. Over to you.
Hello, Joe. Thank you very much. Well, until a few years ago, we seemed to be winning. It really looked as if we were starting to beat hunger. But then in 2014, things began to turn the wrong way. And since then, the number of people who go hungry has started to rise and seems set, unfortunately, to continue to do so. So we got an issue which seemed to be receding into the past, which is now once again very much in the present and the future. And it looks as if there's a real danger that hunger could become endemic across very wide regions of the world, and even that we could face something that seems almost unimaginable today, which is a global net food deficit, and in other words, structural famine. Now, I think there are several reasons why hunger is growing again and why potentially mass famine could unfold in the future. And one of them, of course, is climate breakdown. We're seeing the drying out of some crucial crop growing regions, extreme events such as storms and floods and severe droughts which are wiping out crops. We're even seeing direct impacts of temperature on crop yields. Because some crops can't withstand too much heat. And potentially in the future, we could see temperatures that are too high for livestock and even the farmers themselves in their fields to withstand. On top of that, you've got the loss of soil, which is being caused by careless farming. There's the over-abstraction of water from aquifers, and in some places, particularly the Indus Valley, which is a major potential flashpoint, we could see that coinciding with the loss of water from glaciers and rivers. Then there's the collapse of pollinating insects. There's land grabbing by multinationals and sovereign wealth funds that displaces smallholders who are growing food for essential consumption, with big business growing non-food and luxury crops. And then more importantly than any of these issues at the moment, though they might become more important in future, there's the massive increase in gross demand, which is being caused by two factors really in combination. And the first of them is the smaller of the two factors, and it's declining rapidly, and that's human population growth. But the second factor is much bigger and is growing fast. And this is a dietary shift towards more meat and dairy. And this makes the whole food system much less efficient, as grain and land, which could otherwise have fed human beings directly, is instead used to feed livestock. But there's also something else going on, something that's harder to see, but that might actually be more decisive. And this is the way that the food system itself functions. Now, in producing and trading and distributing food, we've created a classic complex system. And complex systems, regardless of what they are, whether they're in ecology or the atmosphere or finance or the organization of human society, all behave in similar ways. They have emergent properties, which means that they organize themselves. They create order out of chaos. And that might sound like a good thing, but it entirely depends on where the order is heading. Now, the fascinating and alarming thing about complex systems is that you don't even need to know what the system is to determine whether or not it's resilient. You just need to know the values of the various components of the system. And when you know these values, you can determine whether or not the system is likely to sustain itself or whether it's likely to reach a tipping point and then flip into a completely different state, which is a shift which is known as hysteresis. In general, once a system has shifted into a different state, it's very difficult, sometimes impossible, to shift it back. And here are some of the danger signs to look out for in any complex system. First one, does it have a small number of major nodes? In other words, are there a small number of places or things in which a lot of important stuff is happening? Are those nodes strongly connected to each other? Is the modularity of the system declining? In other words, is it becoming less compartmentalized and more globally connected? Is the redundancy in the system declining? In other words, is everything within it becoming more efficient? Is the buffering in the system declining? In other words, are there fewer options for going a different way within the network? Now, what we're inadvertently doing is creating a global system that ticks every one of those boxes when it comes to food production and distribution and trading. As different parts of the world have specialized into growing regions, a high proportion of the exports of each major crop now comes from just a handful of nations. And this trade then passes through the hands of a very small number of corporations, which then channel it through a small number of marine choke points, straits like the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal or the Malacca Straits, to reach the major markets. And at the same time, the global trade in food has broken down what was previously a highly modular system, compartmentalized one, into a far more coherent system in which people around the world are converging towards what some people call a global standard diet. Food grown by similar means everywhere, by farmers using products from the same few corporations. As most of the world's potential farmland's already in use, and in a lot of places crop yields are now approaching pretty well their maximum, the redundancy in the system is also declining rapidly. And at the same time, because of the convergence towards identical growing techniques using identical inputs, there's also less buffering in the system as the number of alternative pathways within the network declines. Now, how can you tell whether a complex system is losing its resilience? In other words, whether it might be approaching a tipping point? Well, what you tend to see is flickering. Its outputs begin to swing more widely. And I'm sorry to say that when you look at the global food system, flickering is what you see. Over the past 3 decades, we've seen ever wider perturbations in food production and supply. And a student of complex systems looking at this pattern would press the panic button. So it's not just that we need to reduce the external pressure on the system, in other words, environmental breakdown and rising demand. If we're going to stand a fair chance of getting through this century without catastrophe, we also need to change the system itself. We need to increase the number of nodes, weaken the links between them, compartmentalize the system, increase its redundancy, increase its buffering. Now, all this might sound counterintuitive because it's the exact opposite of the way we've been going, a way that we've been told is rational and efficient and essential for feeding the world. But staying on your path, regardless of the warnings, is literally how civilizations collapse. As the saying goes, every disaster movie starts with someone ignoring a scientist. Now, there are bad ways of responding to this impending crisis, and there are better ways. For example, you could increase the buffering in the system by expanding into new land. You could cut down more rainforests. You could move into the forests and peat bogs of the boreal zone in the north as global heating permits. But if you do that, you'll accelerate the destruction of our life support systems. And already food production is the major cause of habitat destruction and species extinction. It's the major cause of water depletion and water pollution. It's one of the major causes of climate breakdown. If we take what looks like the obvious and easy way out, we don't solve the crisis, we accelerate it. In fact, looking at the devastating impacts of food production around the world, you quickly come to the conclusion that we need less farming, less use of land, less ploughing, less use of pesticides and fertilizers, yet less use of water for irrigation, less farming, but more food. So how can we possibly square that circle? Well, it seems to me that we need to take a completely different route, and we should start by effectively triaging the system. Which parts of it can we save? Which parts of it should we save? I find it quite useful to recognize that there are actually three almost completely different industries now within the bracket that we call farming. One of them is grain production, one of them is horticulture, producing fruit and vegetables, and one of them is producing protein and fat. And these three industries used to be integrated, but they now function almost as entirely separate networks, each with their own quite dangerous dynamics. But this separation of the systems, dysfunctional as it is in many respects, also, I think, gives us a chance to do things completely differently. And I feel that it's upon this chance that our welfare, in fact, our future prospects depend. Now, there are lots of different things I could discuss here, but I want to focus really on the biggest potential shift, a shift that could greatly increase the modularity of the system, the redundancy of the system, and the buffering of the system, potentially all at the same time. And it involves removing much of the protein and fat we produce from farming altogether. Some of you might have seen the announcement this week that the very first lab-grown meat will soon go on sale in Singapore in the form of cultured chicken produced by a company called Eat Just. But this, it's a fascinating step, and I think it's a very important one, but it still relies on feedstocks which are produced by farming. And I think the much more fundamental and exciting development is the production of completely new feedstocks which don't rely on farming or even on photosynthesis. So last year, I was the first person in the world outside the laboratory staff to eat a pancake made from microbial protein in a lab on the outskirts of Helsinki. And the protein was produced by hydrogen oxygenating soil bacteria, which don't use photosynthesis at all. They are in effect fed on water and electricity, hydrogen produced by electrolysis. This is a far more efficient process than photosynthesis. And because the entire bacteria can be eaten, it's sort of Monge2 bacteria, it's still more efficient in terms of land use and inputs. And the shocking thing about that pancake was that it tasted just like a pancake. Now, I believe that processes like this will soon start to provide the feedstocks used for cultured meat, cultured milk, eggs, fish, and perhaps all sorts of products which no one has even thought of yet. If so, we could create a completely different path for food production, buffering the system. And ideally, because the growing conditions can be created in factories anywhere, we can also reintroduce modularity. We can start compartmentalizing the food system with production that can function independently in any country. Now, this would enable us massively to reduce pressure on the land, reintroducing resilience not just to the global food system, but also to our ecological systems. The spared land could be used on a huge scale for rewilding, which not only restores ecosystems, but also draws down carbon from the atmosphere and locks it up. But if we are to take this route, and I think we should, it's essential that we don't create a new network consisting of just a few nodes that are highly linked. In other words, just replicating the dysfunctions of the current system. In other words, we mustn't allow multinational companies to capture this process. We urgently need to put pressure on governments to ensure that as much of these new developments as possible is developed as open source technology through universities and other public institutions. So in other words, we need to let 1,000 flowers bloom rather than just allow 3 or 4 corporations to mop up the benefits of the new technologies. Now, that's just one side of the solution, and I've got other proposals for potentially transforming horticulture and arable production and making those parts of the system more resilient as well. But maybe those are things that we can explore in the questions. In any case, I hope I've explained that this is a really serious and urgent question, and it's not one that we can afford to fudge. Thank you.
George, thank you ever so much. I begin to think that every disaster movie that starts with ignoring a scientist might be every disaster movie that starts with ignoring George Monbiot. To the audience, just do remember you can just pop your questions in through your comments system, and we will pick them up here. I've got one already, which is there were big arguments against GM foods 20 years ago. We are now talking about lab-based protein foods. Why do we not worry about it in the same way?
Well, some people do worry about it, and there are some genuine things to worry about. And intellectual property rights, I think, is the biggest thing to worry about. I think this is a really alarming side of it, that, you know, that there are companies with dollar signs in their eyes who just think, great, look, here's a whole new field and we can just mop this up. We can be the owners of the core technologies which are developed in this field. So there's several major hazards with that. One is of course corporate control and concentration, which then leads to the network effects that I was talking about. Second is the sort of homogenization, and we end up with pretty bad products because, you know, we just have sort of mass-produced bargain basement stuff as opposed to the great potential diversification. Another is that at least there's one school of thought which says open source happens a lot faster than patented development, and in some fields that seems to be the case, in other fields it doesn't, but that could be the case here. We don't yet know. But I would really hate to see it go down that route. In terms of, oh, it's frankenfoods and, you know, it's unnatural and stuff, that's never so much been a concern of mine. I mean, with GM crops, you know, I have the same concerns about intellectual property. You know, I think it's a really dangerous trend worldwide where it's effectively protectionism. You know, through sort of trade-related intellectual property rights, corporations have been able to shut out their competitors and massively increase their market power with all sorts of detrimental effects. And that has definitely happened with GM crops. And obviously a lot of them, the early ones in particular, were engineered to work with proprietary pesticides, and so it sort of creates vertical integration and horizontal integration within the corporate sector, which is all in lots of ways quite dangerous. So, you know, I think that's the biggest hazard with lab-grown food or factory-produced cultured food, whatever you want to call it. We haven't really settled on a name yet. But you know, the other factor is, oh, people say, well, yuck, that's disgusting. How could anyone possibly want to eat that? Well, all I would say is, if that's what you feel, is go and visit a broiler shed where your chicken comes from, or visit the abattoir where it's slaughtered, or visit the packing plant where it's chopped up and put into packets for you, and then tell me what disgusting looks like.
Okay. Another very straightforward question, which is the new food healthy?
Well, this is a crucial question again, of course. And I mean, in principle, what the companies are aiming to do is to produce something which is effectively identical. It is meat, it is milk, it is egg, but it hasn't come from an animal. So you're producing the same proteins, the same textures, the same components. You know, we need to look at, so will it contain taurine and choline and, you know, other key components, and it should. In principle, you could make it healthier than meat that comes from animals, because you could cut out various unhealthy components. There could be less saturated fat, for example. There could be more long-chain omega-3 fatty acids in it. So you've got potentially a system which actually improves human health impacts while massively reducing the impact on planetary health, on the health of our living systems.
Okay. What are your proposals to deal with the vast number of farmers' incomes globally who don't have access to the labs?
Well, obviously, another very good and important question. The first thing to say is that, you know, I see this really as mopping up the incoming demand for animal products, which is growing at enormous speed. So much of it will be averting future change which would otherwise be felt within the farming system. So it would allow, in a way, the current farming system to continue in ways that this future demand won't, as huge amounts of farmland are mopped up by multinational companies producing soya and maize to feed to farm animals, displacing small farmers who are currently feeding themselves and their neighborhoods. Because that's the way that the animal feed industry is going. It's led to massive consolidation, not just within the processors, but also within the farming sector. And is this a functional system? No, it's a highly dysfunctional system, and it's devastating for farmers as well as for the living world and for the security and resilience of our food system. And so, this, I think in a way, paradoxically, could actually take a lot of pressure off that system and allow different models to start to flourish within a system which has more redundancy, more buffering, more modularity.
So we sort of touched on this quite a lot, but I just wonder if we just try go a little bit further. We've got one question that's coming in. Is, with a drive towards efficiency making the most sense for not wasting resources, how will the future process not align in a similar way to the current system? How do you make sure the two things, you can essentially diverge the path at this point in time?
Yes, well, of course, these are all dangers. I mean, none of this is a panacea, because it can succumb to the same forces as have been bearing upon the global food system as it currently exists. It could be a really great way of creating resilience for the reasons that I pointed out, creating totally new pathways, taking pressure off the land, massively increasing our buffering against future food stocks and providing food which wouldn't otherwise have been there, averting structural famine. So it's got quite a lot on the plus side here. But at the same time, with this capture and streamlining by corporations, which, unless governments step in and invoke antitrust law and actually say we're going to develop public streams for this as well as private streams, that will happen. That's the default state. That's the default trajectory that a new technology like this will take, and we could end up with your Facebook or your Google of microbial protein, and I absolutely don't want that to happen, which is one very powerful motivation for me to get in at the beginning of this process and saying this is a great technology which could be used massively for the benefit of humanity and the rest of the living world, or it could go down a pretty bad route. And so let's stop it going down that bad route before it takes off.
Okay. The favourite question I've got coming is, do you have a podcast?
Of my own, no, I don't. No.
That seems to be a suggestion. Could I ask you one question, which is, with Brexit arriving, the UK is reshaping its vision of how it uses its agricultural systems and the environment. What do you think about the sort of proposals put forward by George Eustice? Do you think there's progress being made in the UK on essentially trying to reshift what we've been doing historically?
Well, the first thing to say is that if you went out of your way to design the worst possible farm subsidy system, you could not have done better than the European Common Agricultural Policy. It is a total catastrophe. And I'm a Remainer, but I'm a Eurosceptic Remainer. I think there's a lot of issues with the European Union. But top of the list is this utterly disastrous farm subsidy system, which basically pays people for owning land. The more land you own, the more you get paid. So it's this fantastically regressive redistribution of money. All of us as taxpayers throw money into the pot, and the oligarchs are given that money by the European Union. It's an absolute outrage. I mean, it's amazing to me that people don't take to the streets about this. And there are people from all over the world come like wasps to a honeypot to Europe to buy land to harvest these subsidies. You've got oil sheikhs, you've got Russian oligarchs, you've got Texas mining barons, you've got people from all over the world saying, whoa, this is just a bonanza. I'm going to be given money for owning land. And as a result of that, the land price is going to rise as well. What's not to like about this system? It's disgraceful. But also environmentally, it's a catastrophe, because the land you get paid for owning is land which is in agricultural condition. That you don't actually have to produce any food, but it has to look as if food is produced there. That's what you get judged on. And what that means is land that's bare, land without wildlife habitats. If it's got wildlife habitat on it, you don't get your money. So it creates this massive perverse incentive for clearing wildlife habitat. And across the EU, hundreds of thousands of hectares of habitat have been destroyed solely in order to make the land qualify for subsidies. So whatever the British government does, it's bound to be better than the appalling dysfunctional system we're coming out of. But the whole thing hinges on whether the government's actually prepared to implement it. Because what you got on paper looks pretty good. But at the same time, we've been seeing this slashing of regulatory capacity across the board in the UK. So if you look at the Environment Agency, Natural England, the Rural Payments Agency, they've all been cut to the bone. They've lost their budgets. They've got no staff who can just get out into the field and look at what's happening. They can't even look at the satellite maps. They don't have the money. So unless you actually have good monitoring and enforcement, none of it's actually going to happen, because all that will happen is they'll say, right, do you own the land? And the farmer says, yes. Are you doing what we've asked you to do? Oh, yes, I'm definitely doing it. Right, fine, here's your money. That's how the system will work.
Right, well, let's see if that prediction turns out to be true. George, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you ever so much. Just a reminder that George has a number of books that you can buy, including Feral and Out of the Wreckage, and we look forward to the podcast.
Thanks so much.